Hey guys, it's Graham. What's crackin'? I apologize for the picture video. I tried to do an actual video out in my shop, but I'm still having microphone feedback issues, so sorry about that. Let's talk about American Prometheus. It's a 2005 biography written by Kai Bird and Martin Sherman about J. Robert Oppenheimer. It's the book that inspired Christopher Nolan to make the Oppenheimer movie, coming out into theaters this weekend. I'm not going to make it to theaters to see that, but I decided to listen to the audiobook while I was at work this week just to know more of what it was about. Taking a look at the IMDb page and matching up the different actors with the different figures in this story. I don't want to say characters; these were real people. It's interesting to see Christopher Nolan's casting choices. I do like the fact that he draws from a big pool of recognizable actors. Doesn't just shoot his shot on one or two for title roles. It feels like everybody in this is a name. Cillian Murphy, obviously with the title role. Emily Blunt plays his wife, Kitty, who she had been married in real life. The real Kitty, she'd been married a couple of times before, and she'd been a card-carrying member of the Communist Party. That's relevant because of what happened after his work on the Manhattan Project, Oppenheimer's work. Matt Damon plays General Groves, the military leader of the Manhattan Project. All of the scientists were civilians, even though they were issued uniforms and such. Groves was the military man there to oversee the whole process. I think one of the more interesting castings is going to be Robert Downey Jr. as Congressman Lewis Strauss. After the Manhattan Project, he was kind of the leading figure in trying to prosecute Oppenheimer and bring him up on charges of espionage and of passing American atomic secrets to the Soviets. After World War II, when the Cold War started and America had teamed up with Stalin to defeat Hitler, suddenly we were in a nuclear standoff with the Soviets, and they had nukes far sooner than anybody expected, and it was assumed that somebody who had handed off those nuclear secrets was also the same person who opposed the United States government having those secrets and had had ties to communist people in America in his past, and that person was Oppenheimer. Now, the book does a great deal of digging up, factual evidence, court proceedings, hearings notes, all that stuff, to explain, A, why Strauss and Congress thought that Oppenheimer had these connections, but B, why Oppenheimer wasn't the man who did it. He did, unfortunately, have his national security clearance revoked, and he was pariahed, and the papers kind of had a field day with him. Saying, hey, look at all these people he knew and loved, and, they were communists, they were card-carrying American Communist Party members, and he had given funds to them, and, Oppenheimer had to appear before Congress and explain, yeah, this was a position that I took in my youth. I no longer, and I haven't for a long time, thought that the Communist Party was the vehicle towards the things that I really value. He was a social justice valuer. He wanted things that didn't really exist in America at the time, desegregation and so forth. And so, in its zeal to root out actual communist spies in the government in turn dredged a lot of innocent people, through that process. As a side note, there's another book that I want to read called Blacklisted by History, which says that it offers up a more detailed analysis of Joe McCarthy and his work fighting communism through the Senate. As a reminder, he wasn't involved with the House Un-American Activities Committee. That was a House panel. He was a senator. I had checked out a copy of this book from the library a number of years ago and made it through the foreword, but it was a big, thick, heavy tome, and I didn't have the time to read it all in print before I had to give it back to the library. There was a waiting list on it. So I have since acquired a copy of the audiobook, and I'll be getting to that eventually. With big factual historical books like this, I don't just slam them out back to back. I've usually got to wait several weeks in between reading one just because it's a lot to absorb. And Bird and Sherman were very detailed in their work here on Oppenheimer. They cover everything from his parents to his early life, his childhood, his impressive intellect at a young age, his professorship in his 20s, various romances that he had before he met Kitty, and then through his work on the Manhattan Project and his time going through the congressional hearings on the charge of espionage. I'm going to guess that Nolan's movie will deal a lot with those charges, especially since he casted a big-name actor to play Louis Strauss, along with others. I also thought it was interesting that he casted somebody to play Jeannie, who was his ex-fiancée, or at least the girlfriend that he had before he got married. According to the book, he still had dalliances with her in the early years of his marriage. And since she was, like his wife, a communist activist, the FBI was spying on her, and then she committed suicide while he was still, while he was working on the Manhattan Project. And so it was just one other big domino in a long line of dominoes that the FBI wanted to topple on its way to finding somebody to blame for the Soviets getting nukes. If anything, this just, my takeaway was, as always, that three-letter alphabet agencies need to be disbanded and abolished, and chief among them is the FBI, especially as it behaved under Hoover. The one good thing that I can think of that the FBI has done is finding the culprit of the Osage murders in the 1920s. That's a story outlined in Killers of the Flower Moon, which will also be getting a 3-hour movie treatment coming up soon, this time from Martin Scorsese, starring big names like DiCaprio, De Niro, John Lithgow, a bunch of others. That was a stupendous book. It made my best of 2022 list. American Prometheus was very good. It won't make my best of year list, but it was a very interesting read. I always enjoy reading biographies of very successful and very well-read men. When I dropped out of college, one of my frustrations with it was that I wanted to just learn a trade, and I didn't want to deal with all of the generals that came along with a bachelor's degree. I was still going to pursue those interests independently. I didn't want them tied to any licensure that I needed for a particular job. But a life like Oppenheimer's makes the case for pairing the humanities to a technical trade, or at least to a disciplined STEM trade like his. He was a professor of theoretical physics. That was one of the things that made his appointment to the Manhattan Project unique, because it was going to be really his first time dealing with practical physics, along with it being his first time in a leadership role of something of that magnitude. But the book chronicles all of that, his youth, the Manhattan Project, and the espionage hearings afterward. I think it's all a very worthwhile read. You get not just a good glimpse of the man, but everybody around him that was important to him. And, assuming on its face that the picture painted of him by his biographers is accurate, I think it makes for a very sympathetic casting of an admirable man. One final note on that subject. I've read a bunch of books by David McCullough, especially his big, thick biography of John Adams that came out forever and a day ago. And I remember discussing it probably in 2008 or 2009 with my brother, Jordan, who has a doctorate in political philosophy. And he was the first person I encountered who was actually critical of McCullough's approach to biographies, categorizing him as being a little bit too friendly to his subjects. He spit shines them a little bit too much. He doesn't really highlight their flaws as he's highlighting their virtues. And I think that's significant because a biography, while it's understandable that a biographer would be passionate about the subject that he's studying, a biography should also be dispassionate when it comes to the facts and just lay them out plainly. The reason I mention this is that in 2019, I read McCullough's biography of Truman, which was 54-something hours in audio. Massive, massive book. And as with John Adams, I came away with this picture of a man who was just incredibly admirable and did a good job for his time. But Byrd and Sherman highlight some of the aggression that Truman harbored toward Oppenheimer, and some of the intense attitudes that he held towards him, especially when it came time for Oppenheimer to plead for transparency in nuclear development, nuclear disarmament, international nuclear diplomacy, and things like that. Truman didn't want him weighing in on those things. He just wanted him to make the bomb. And Oppenheimer, being a student of the humanities and not just the sciences, he understood the practical application and the international and cultural devastation that a weapon like this would do to the world, would wreak upon the world. The military only understood things in terms of tactics and wartime diplomacy, whereas he was able to bring in my opinion, a much more necessary perspective to it. Interestingly enough, after Truman left office and Eisenhower would come in and he would spend 8 years in Washington and then leave with a warning against the military-industrial complex, I wonder, especially looking at Oppenheimer's life and how the military and the government kind of railroaded him after taking his creation, I wonder if he wasn't already just a little bit too late in that warning. But that's perhaps a subject for another day. I do highly recommend American Prometheus by Bird and Sherman. It's a very good read. Like I said, won't make my best of the year, but it's worth it to read, and I'm glad that I did. If you see the movie this weekend, let me know what you think in the comments below. Subscribe and comment and share and all that stuff. It'll help me get money so I can buy a better microphone. Thanks for watching, you guys. Drive safe. See you out there.